An angel's report, and four-dimensional thinking. As with mathematics, there is language. The lie that everyone lives is the degree of awareness that each person has acquired about reality. Insert. The inverted universe. The concept of an inverted universe, and how natural laws and physical processes would behave in it according to the work of William James Sidis, called The Animate and the Inanimate. The idea is that in an inverted universe time runs in reverse order, but all spatial positions and distances remain the same. This concept helps to test the reversibility of natural laws. Key points from the text of The Animate and the Inanimate. Reversibility in time. Natural laws remain valid in an inverted universe where time runs backward. The inverted universe, a hypothetical universe in which time runs backward, but spatial relationships remain unchanged. This is compared to the image in a mirror, where one spatial dimension is reversed. Conservation of positions and intervals. In the inverted universe, all positions in space and the size of time intervals remain the same, but the order of time is reversed. Motion and speed. The path of a moving object remains the same in the inverted universe, but the direction of motion is reversed. Speeds are equal in magnitude but opposite in direction. Acceleration. Acceleration remains unchanged in both direction and magnitude in the inverted universe. Dynamics and mass. The mass of objects does not change with time reversal. This means that impulses are reversed in direction but remain the same in magnitude. Forces remain unchanged in both direction and magnitude. Energy. Energy remains unchanged in the inverted universe because it depends on factors such as position and mass, which are not affected by time reversal. Causality. The relationship between cause and effect becomes more complex in the inverted universe. Logical relationships and reasons remain unchanged, but physical cause and effect relationships may be reversed or modified. Physical properties. Properties such as density, specific heat, and elasticity do not change in the inverted universe. However, electric currents would be reversed. This conceptual model helps to understand the fundamental laws of nature and their independence of the direction of time. According to this theory, the second law of thermodynamics would not be reversed. So far, the work of William James Sidis. My own theories and assumptions in my work are based on the idea that psychotic decompensation occurs when the mind does not want to conform to the reversibility of the universe. If that is too complex for you, or if you are not open to openly arguing the nature of reality, then you are better off not reading my work. So far, the insert. I hope you enjoy reading it. Preface. I don't know where to begin. So much has happened in my life so far. I am very disappointed in the life I have lived so far. And despite very careful planning from my special perspective on the world, I have not been able to prevent many disappointments. However, I have been able to retain my zest for life as much as possible, and learn a lot from what has happened to me in my life. But what good is life wisdom if you have had to experience so many setbacks at a young age that you have to spend the rest of your life looking for both physical and mental health, which has been partly taken away from me. Also, the possibilities that I thought were possible when I was young are no longer achievable within this lifetime. How should I look at the world, if I abhor my life as it is now, as well as the reality that goes with it? I am embittered, and I don't want to continue in this life anymore. But I don't want to die either. Somewhere in this contradiction, my continued existence is guaranteed. But do I even want that? After all, I was put aside by my own mother because she said she couldn't raise me during the week. I also experience a generalized form of distrust as a result of everything I have been through, which I was unable to comprehend emotionally. As a result, the diagnosis that was made incorrectly in my early teens has become a reality. A kind of historical falsification if one were to look at the file now. But was I ever sick, or was I indeed made sick? Who am I really? Unfortunately, this period in my life was neither the beginning nor the end of my misery. In this book, I will try to describe in as much detail as possible what has happened in my life, and how I experience it. I also hope to help people who have experienced similar things, or are currently experiencing them, in their grieving and processing. I am not doing this out of self-pity, but with the aim of helping other people. However, I came to the conclusion, to note, that after much philosophizing, I came to a similar conclusion as described in the work of William James Sidis, The Animate and the Inanimate. I see explanations for what happened to me in his work. Introduction. To understand the context, it is important to understand that the context in this book is presented as an explanation for the traumas I have suffered, based on metaphysics, philosophy, psychology, spirituality, and my own explanations and interpretations of these. It is important to understand that the context of this book is so abstract that the interpretation of every detail is necessary to understand this book. Nothing in this book is true by definition, and can be seen as a collection of interpretations. I will also explain the origin of my axioms, assumptions and/or interpretations in the footnotes and throughout the chapters where necessary. An important reference to the origin of a number of phenomena as described in this book is the phenomenon of the sorting demon, as described in the work of William James Sidis, called The Animate and the Inanimate. Reading this work is essential, as are other books that I will refer to in the footnotes, to understand, among other things, the context of the thought process I use to predict the future and channel my intuition, as well as other metaphors or assumptions I describe in this book. I refer to a number of works by other people in my work, as these form the basis for much of my analysis. To understand the essence of the hysteria associated with traumas such as I experience, it is important to read the works of Sigmund Freud. They give some indication of the perception of the bystander. It is also important to understand that I use mathematical principles, and describe how mathematical principles can be exchanged as a metaphor for principles such as those described in beliefs. I then give a philosophical interpretation of this, which is relative and not definitive. I will also write words in such a way that they can be interpreted multidimensionally, and I therefore ask the reader to use the most likely context to filter these multiple interpretations, and to assume an objective description when it comes to the coloring of any metaphors or points of view. I also have a tendency to use words inappropriately, and to exclude the meaning of a pleonasm. This inappropriate word usage usually manifests itself in the addition of meanings, which makes a sentence very complex in terms of meaning and interpretation, but at first glance seems very simple. I have a definite tendency to process imagery in a sentence, and to use the sum of multiple meanings in the same sentence in such a way that it can be interpreted in multiple ways, making it multidimensional. However, it is the context that determines where the text derives its meaning from. This is normally the intention of the sentence constructions as I describe them. Unfortunately, I will not use mathematical formulas, but describe how phenomena work, because I am myself not able to understand these formulas. Formulas are so abstract for me that I dissociate in a rather remarkable way. An example of such a description could be the following. Within my visual perception, a number of geometric objects will manifest themselves, which I suspect are a visual representation of reality as I experience it at that moment. This automatic calculation can become a cascade in which my consciousness starts to make automatic geometric calculations that are related to each other. This is because this visual perception is an analogy for the abstraction of the meaning that I experience at that moment, and the spider's web of associations that are related to this within my thought process. This results from the flood of information, which can only be regulated by using the efficiency of, among other things, the visual cortex to be able to process meanings and abstract the paired context for making choices and interpreting the reality to which I relate. Unfortunately, I have a tendency to lose control over this, control that I already have minimal over this phenomenon. This could also be an escape mechanism for my mind. However, it usually has the result that my consciousness suffers greatly from an increasing degree of rationalization, which can ultimately lead to me psychotic decompensation. This may be due to the change in the paradigm of my consciousness, which arises from the very rapid equalization of energy levels, including the leveling of available energy and unavailable energy, entropy. I want to prevent this as much as necessary, or at least undergo the speed at which this information processing takes place as much as possible. Also because I suspect that the potential energy, as it seems to exist in the future, becomes deterministic through these calculations from my visual perception, and can therefore also take on a life of its own. This is also related to the fear that has a causal relationship in the desire to manifest this control over reality. However, it is important to assume that when accelerating these calculations, there will eventually come a point where I escape the space-time continuum in my thoughts, and this has the consequence that I get thoughts that are related to this potential energy. These could be parallel realities, multiple futures, and so on. This is therefore probably related to the paradoxes that arise between my energy and my unavailable energy within my perception, consciousness. The imbalance in these energy levels therefore seems to exacerbate or activate this psychotic decompensation from the paradoxes that have arisen over the years. This could amount to a rationalization of a copy of reality, which may originally have arisen as an escape from reality, which arose from the emptiness I experienced from the realization of a reality that I rationalize. My assumption is therefore that the unavailable energy increases as the universe expands, and this in itself accelerates the process of expansion of the universe. This may have to do with perception, which increases as the number of data points within a relativistic perspective increase. This will perhaps increase the chaos in this universe. The total amount of energy also increases in this way, and thus also the mass. The specific gravity presumably decreases due to relativity, because the frame of reference within which a phenomenon exists may decrease in relevance, increasing entropy. This could possibly influence the influence of gravity in the long term. This is also reasoned from a mathematical assumption, where the universe is divided into several mathematical dimensions. As far as we know, we live in the third mathematical dimension. From our perception, energy and unavailable energy could exist, but to what extent they could be compatible may depend on the time momentum within which they are relative. In that sense, there should also be an anti-relativity. This could suggest that in a one-dimensional situation both energies could be united in that same dimension, which would suggest that they are identical there. This would mean that a particle from one-dimensional mathematics has control over all matter, energy, mathematics, unavailable energy, and for example in all dimensions above it. This would then come about because both energy and entropy, unavailable energy, in such a mathematical dimension are directly interchangeable, making it possible to realize any manifestation, but also to reverse it immediately. One could see this as the mathematical principle of a God. My interpretation would therefore be that this one-dimensional phenomenon contains both unavailable energy, and that the effect of this cannot be described. If one were to live in a deterministic universe, this possibility cannot be ruled out, whereby in a non-deterministic universe this rule confirms itself, since a non-deterministic universe can always contain an element of determinism. This is also where my assumption of pure energy comes from. This pure energy would be this one-dimensional mathematical energy. And my guess is that this one-dimensional energy can be cultivated when life arises. In the Bible, the reference to the child of God may perhaps be interpreted from the principle that the awareness of the ego leads to a definition of being a child of God, which would imply that everyone's past, namely being that child, can lead to a connection with that pure energy that encompasses the self. It could then be that if man moves to the first mathematical dimension, he comes to what he himself is, and that is why the Bible describes that man is created in the image of God. However, I cannot verify this principle, and I prefer to remain human for the time being. As a human being, this principle cannot be grasped on the basis of feeling. This could also mean that if Jesus was God, he sacrificed his own future when he descended to our perception, and by the return of Jesus he means that everyone could take his place. To what extent this is true is difficult to say. It is also possible that his potential energy and a part of his normal energy were sacrificed, and that he gave us his potential energy if we believe in him. However, this has the consequence that our awareness of this energy is in conflict with itself. However, in addition to the aforementioned, my guess is that in a four-dimensional space, the objects that are in this dimension are influenced by time more slowly than in the third dimension, or not at all. This would be a partial paradox from our perception, but it would imply that in a one-dimensional space time goes faster than in a three-dimensional space, and at the same time slower. It would also imply that the mass or specific gravity, relative to the third mathematical dimension, is smaller due to relativity. This would imply that the relationship between energy and mass is different in other mathematical dimensions. However, this would mean a paradox in the first mathematical dimension. Therefore, the most likely explanation would be that in a one-dimensional mathematical dimension there are only phenomena that are comparable to what in the third mathematical dimension would be explained as quantum mechanics, and dark energy, or perhaps infinite density, whereby quantum mechanics is a way to alternate the logic of all mathematical dimensions. In the third mathematical dimension, the faster time construction manifests itself as quantum mechanics within particles as we know them, and the slower time construction around particles as energy that holds these particles together. The time mechanics between these two extremes produces the reality as we experience it. And if time is relative, and time and mass differ per dimension relative to other dimensions, then the location of mass and time also probably differs interdimensionally. And if so, then the influence that mass and energy exert between different dimensions may be possible to influence, or even change. If you were to map this by means of a phenomenon that resembles the refraction of sunlight, colors of the rainbow on water, you might be able to map how mathematical dimensions relate to each other. Unfortunately, as far as I know, such a device does not exist. One way to find out is probably by using consciousness to map these dimensions. You would then use your consciousness as a sorting demon, as described in The Animate and Inanimate by William James Sidis. You could do this by making a change in consciousness, so that you can not only map the third mathematical dimension, but also perceive other dimensions. Of course, this must be done carefully, because of course you want all thought experiments to take place in such a way that they remain relative to the third dimension and you stay as much as possible in the third dimension. But how do you know how far you can deviate from three-dimensional perception? If you assume that the geometric tensor of consciousness describes choice as a potential quantum mechanical position between several mathematical dimensions, then I can extrapolate the quantum mechanical state of consciousness in the present in such a way that I can perceive the difference between the present and the future, and thus calculate the future. It would also mean that I can reverse the quantum mechanical state, and thus the potential energy of the future that I leave behind would contain reserve energy. This energy would have properties that could be quantum mechanical in nature, with the possible property of observation in the opposite direction. This could also be the case for a binary choice. So I wanted to show this with a thought experiment. If this thought experiment were to succeed, it would imply that reality is relative. It would also make the description of a choice and the time associated with it very complex. I predicted that the best way to make this work would be to reverse cause and effect in my consciousness, and to compare the difference between the present that I leave and the future that I enter with the reality as it was and is in reality, cause and then effect, instead of effect and then cause. Then I would change the variables that make up consciousness and observe what effect this has on my perception of reality. I came to the conclusion that the energy that my mind encompasses moves in the opposite direction of the time in which matter moves, without being aware of it. This gives me the suspicion that the present is the three-dimensional contradiction between the future and the past. However, choice is a zero-dimensional contradiction. This has to do with the idea that finite things can happen infinitely when probability is zero. I will come back to this later. This would also explain why I had an enormous amount of pressure in my head at a young age. I saw all the possibilities, without solutions. I still have that tendency. This is also where my assumption of four-dimensional thinking comes from. I suspect that spacetime is a four-dimensional mathematical reality, where control over spacetime only exists in a four-dimensional reality. Each mathematical dimension is dependent on the influence of each other. The potential energy that arises from the contradictions between the various mathematical dimensions causes an increase in variety between interdimensional communication as a result of the relative mathematical positioning, which in itself is a catalyst for the expansion of the universe, namely an increase in quantum mechanics. I found that during these experiments there were discrepancies in my perception of reality, and this resulted in discrepancies in my perception of spacetime. This is a phenomenon that is synonymous with the development of a psychotic decompensation as far as I know. It would imply that our perception of reality dictates in which universe, parallel, a human being finds himself. However, combined with relativity, this would mean a complex problem when it comes to making choices. It could imply that relativity is quantum mechanical, or as described earlier, that if you assume that the geometric tensor of consciousness describes choice as a potential quantum mechanical position between several mathematical dimensions, then I can extrapolate the quantum mechanical state of consciousness in the present in such a way that I can perceive the difference between the present and the future, and thus calculate the future. This also applies to a binary choice. If you assume that a binary choice of consciousness describes choice as a potential quantum mechanical position between a binary choice, then I can extrapolate the quantum mechanical state of consciousness in the present in such a way that I can perceive the difference between the present and the future, and thus calculate the future. For me, this is a way to frame fear within my autistic black and white thinking. After all, binary means that there are only two possibilities. Something happens, or nothing happens. Something is on, or something is off. Something happens, or something doesn't happen. The light in the room is on, or it is off. If something is more abstract, then I look at each topic to see how much something is or is not like that. In other words, I look where something fits within a binary spectrum, and where it fits most, whether or not 1 or 0. In that respect, I think like a computer, because a computer also only thinks within the binary mathematical principle, or black and white. To analyze this, I have developed a 4-dimensional thought construct that allows me to observe reality within relativity. I predicted that this can be done by the following method. Consider the following sentence construction. I worked hard today and came to the conclusion that my work has contributed to a better society. When I would observe this, I would look at the extent to which there are objective truths, break down the words and individual letters, and calculate the bias between the various degrees of objectivity. I would use this as the basis for my psychoanalysis, and from this simulate a 4-dimensional geometric figure, a so-called paradigm, that corresponds as much as possible to the real nature of the person, in order to approximately understand the person's perception from there, and thus to extrapolate the possible future nature of this geometric figure from an analysis based on the properties of the relativity of his paradigm. From here I can approximately interpret the current and future nature of someone's consciousness, by extrapolation of the corresponding paradigms. I also use a similar method for the visual information. When such analyses contribute to the perception of reality in general, they have the consequence that the perception of reality is expanded, but also that the awareness of this comes with an increase in rationalization. This can have the result that the mental input undermines itself for energetic reasons. The objective approach would then be in conflict with its own interest, since the rule confirms the exception. This would mean that in order to investigate to what extent I can deviate from a 3-dimensional perception, when analyzing 4-dimensional reality, I must first sufficiently understand and maintain the mechanisms of 3-dimensional reality within my perception. To substantiate this perception, and the mechanisms that contribute to coping with my traumatic experiences, I describe the causal relationships between the two in this book. I wish you pleasant reading.